What was the evidence from 130,000 years ago?
Because what they found was evidence that those mastodon bones had been cracked open by human beings using tools, and that the marrow had been extracted.
In 1992, construction workers near San Diego dug up the bones of a mastodon, a massive Ice Age animal that went extinct thousands of years ago.
It's a mastodon skeleton that was excavated. It was actually found by accident during road construction near San Diego.
The bones were broken, not by time, not by the earth shifting. They were broken deliberately by something that knew exactly what it was doing. When scientists tested those bones, they got back one number: 130,000 years. That number did not just challenge what we know about American history. It destroyed it completely.
The conclusion of the team was that only one kind of creature could have done that work using tools on a mastodon, and that's human beings. That's classic human behavior.
Because if something was here that long ago, then everything we were taught about who the first Americans truly were is wrong. The site that almost disappeared. In 1992, a construction crew near San Diego, California, was doing something completely ordinary. They were expanding a road. Heavy machines were cutting deep into the earth, tearing through layers of ancient soil that had not been touched in thousands of years. Nobody expected anything unusual. It was just another day of work. Then the machines hit something. A paleontologist named Richard Cerruti was on site that day. He noticed large bones protruding from the freshly cut soil. He called for the machines to stop. And just like that, one of the most controversial archaeological discoveries in American history began with a single moment of attention. But here is the part that should disturb you. The machines had already been tearing through that ground before anyone noticed. A significant portion of whatever was buried there may have already been destroyed, chewed up and discarded as rubble before a single scientist saw it. What survived was not the full picture. It was a fragment, a remnant. The evidence that would go on to shake the entire field of archaeology almost never made it out of the ground. Once the work stopped, archaeologists moved in. For 5 months, they worked carefully and slowly, using fine tools to excavate the site with surgical precision. Every fragment mattered. Every stone, every bone, every piece of the puzzle had to be recovered intact. What they found was a mastodon. A mastodon is an ancient animal that looks similar to an elephant but was larger, heavier, and built for the brutal conditions of the Ice Age. These animals once roamed across North America in enormous numbers before disappearing around 10,000 years ago. Finding mastodon bones in Ice Age soil is not unheard of. But what made this discovery different had nothing to do with the animal itself. It had everything to do with what had been done to it. The bones were not lying the way a skeleton naturally rests after an animal dies and decomposes. They were broken, badly broken, and not in the way bones crack and crumble after thousands of years of soil pressure. This damage looked different. It looked intentional. It looked like something had been done to these bones on purpose, by something that knew exactly what it was doing. This site would come to be known as the Cerruti Mastodon Site, and for the next several decades, it would sit quietly at the edges of scientific debate, waiting for technology that could finally answer the question nobody yet dared to ask out loud. Something had been here. But what? And when? The bones had survived for an unimaginable stretch of time underground. But what they looked like when archaeologists uncovered them was not the remains of an animal that simply died and decayed. It looked like the aftermath of something far more deliberate. The crime scene. When forensic investigators arrive at a crime scene, they do not just look at what is broken. They look at what is not broken. They look at what was moved, what was left behind, and what the pattern of damage tells them about who was there and what they were doing. That is exactly what researchers did at the Cerruti site. And what they found was not random. It was a pattern, a very specific, very deliberate pattern. The large bones were destroyed. The femurs, which are the thick thigh bones, and the major limb bones were shattered into multiple fragments. These are the densest, hardest bones in the entire body. Breaking them is not easy, yet they were crushed. The small bones were completely untouched. The ribs, the vertebrae, the thin, flat bones were found whole and intact, lying exactly as they had settled thousands of years ago. Not a single one of them showed the kind of damage the large bones showed. Think about what that means. If the ground had simply shifted and collapsed over thousands of years, the damage would be random. Some big bones broken, some small bones broken, everything mixed up in a chaotic mess. But that is not what happened here. Only the hardest, densest bones were targeted. The fragile ones were left alone. That is not an accident. That is a choice. Then there were the stones. Mixed within the clusters of shattered bone, researchers found 5 large cobblestones made of a rock called andesite. Andesite is a volcanic rock, extremely dense and hard. These cobbles weighed up to 30 pounds each. That is roughly the weight of a large bag of rice. Heavy, solid, and built to withstand serious force. The soil surrounding them was fine, soft silt. Silt is the kind of material that only settles in calm, slow-moving water. There were no rivers nearby. There were no floods that could have carried 30-pound rocks into this precise location. And andesite is not native to that area. Those stones came from somewhere else. Whatever was at this site selected specific stones, carried them to this exact spot, and placed them here for a reason. When researchers examined the damage on the bones more closely, 3 specific patterns emerged. The first was spiral fractures. A spiral fracture is a corkscrew-like break that only occurs when a bone is struck while it is still fresh and full of moisture. Old, dry, fossilized bones do not spiral fracture. They shatter differently. This damage happened when the bone was new. The second pattern was percussion cones. These are small, clean, crater-like impact points caused by a concentrated, heavy blow landing on a single spot. The third was bone flakes. Small chips struck off the bone in a way that matched exactly how ancient humans made stone tools. The stones showed matching damage, worn edges, impact scars, and fractures from repeated heavy use. Some stones had been used as hammers. Others had stayed stationary and acted as anvils. Then came the detail that stopped everyone cold. Some of the bone fragments and stone pieces could be physically fitted back together, like puzzle pieces snapping into place. Scientists could hold a chip of bone and a piece of stone and press them together and see exactly how they collided. They were reconstructing a single moment of impact from deep in the past. That was not geology. That was a frozen action. A moment preserved in bone and stone for longer than the modern human species has existed on this earth. Something brought those stones there. Something used them with purpose and precision. And the evidence of that act survived all this time, waiting to be found. But a crime scene without a motive is just chaos. The pattern of damage told researchers what happened. The specific bones that were targeted told them exactly why. The motive. Every action leaves a reason behind it. And at the Cerruti site, the reason was locked inside the bones themselves. By this point, researchers had already established that the damage on these bones was not accidental. The pattern was too specific. The stones had been brought from somewhere else. The impacts were deliberate and targeted. Something had done this on purpose. And the question that followed naturally was simple. Why? The answer pointed directly to early humans or their close relatives. Ancient hominins, which is the scientific term for early humans, and the species closely related to them, are known to have processed large animal carcasses for food across Africa, Europe, and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. The behavior was well documented, and what researchers found at Cerruti matched that behavior almost exactly. The large bones were targeted because of what they contained: bone marrow. Marrow is a soft, fatty, protein-rich substance packed deep inside the thickest bones of large animals. It is one of the most calorie-dense foods found in nature, rich in fat and nutrients. For any creature trying to survive in a harsh and brutal environment, it was extraordinarily valuable. The Ice Age was not a comfortable time to be alive. Food was never guaranteed. Winters were severe. The difference between finding enough calories and not finding them was often the difference between surviving the season and dying in it. In that world, the marrow inside a mastodon's femur was not just food, it was survival. Small bones contain almost no marrow worth extracting. That is precisely why they were left untouched. This was not destruction for its own sake. It was a calculated, precise operation. Target only what has nutritional value. Leave everything else alone. Now consider how difficult that operation actually was. Mastodon femurs are among the hardest biological structures in nature. Dense, thick, and heavily mineralized. Cracking one open requires selecting a stone heavy and hard enough to do the job, positioning the bone so it does not shift under impact, and striking repeatedly at the exact point where the bone is most vulnerable. Researchers who have experimentally replicated this process describe it as physically exhausting and technically demanding, even when you already know what you're doing. Whatever process this mastodon had done this before. It had knowledge. It had technique. It had memory. This is what made the Ceruti site so difficult to dismiss. This exact behavior, smashing large bones for marrow while leaving small bones completely untouched, has been found at ancient hominin sites across Africa, Europe, and Asia. Sites hundreds of thousands of years old. It is one of the most recognized signatures of early human activity in the entire archaeological record. When researchers looked at the damage patterns at Ceruti, they were not looking at something strange or unrecognizable. They were looking at a pattern they had seen many times before, at confirmed human sites on the other side of the planet. The behavior was completely familiar. The location was impossible. There is also a darker layer to this. At comparable sites in Africa of similar age, marrow processing was often a communal activity. Multiple individuals working the same carcass at the same time, each with a role, each contributing to the process. If that same pattern applies here, this was not a single desperate creature stumbling across a dead animal. This was a group, organized, coordinated, working together with a shared purpose on a continent that, according to everything science believed, no thinking creature should have reached for another 115,000 years. The behavior was unmistakable. The evidence was physical and patterned. But none of it meant anything without answering the one question that would either make this the most important discovery in American history or collapse it entirely. When did this happen? The number that breaks everything. Dating the Ceruti site was not straightforward. It was not even possible for decades after the bones were first found. The most widely used dating method in archaeology is called radiocarbon dating. Here is how it works. Every living thing absorbs a form of carbon while it is alive. The moment it dies, that carbon begins breaking down at a slow, steady, predictable rate. By measuring how much of that carbon remains in a bone or piece of organic material, scientists can calculate how long ago the creature died. It works reliably for remains up to about 50,000 years old. The Ceruti mastodon bones were far beyond that range. They had been in the ground so long that every trace of organic material inside them had completely vanished. There was nothing left to measure. Radiocarbon dating was useless. It was not until decades after the 1992 excavation, using technology that did not exist at the time of the dig, that scientists could attempt a definitive age. The findings were not published until 2017, a full 25 years after the bones were first uncovered. That 25-year gap has never been fully or satisfactorily explained. The method scientists used instead is called uranium-thorium dating. Here is how to understand it simply. Over thousands of years, a buried bone slowly absorbs tiny traces of uranium from the groundwater seeping through the surrounding soil. Once inside the bone, that uranium begins to decay at a constant known rate, gradually changing into a different element called thorium. By measuring the exact ratio of uranium to thorium inside the bone, scientists can calculate precisely how long it has been in the ground. The more thorium compared to uranium, the older the bone. multiple bones from across the site were tested independently. Every single result came back consistent. No outliers, no anomalies. Every sample told the same story. Here is the rewritten section. The implications are now spelled out clearly and simply so every viewer understands exactly why this number is so devastating. The site dated to approximately 130,000 years ago. That number needs to be understood properly, because on its own, it is just a number. But in the context of human history, it is a bomb. Here is what science has believed for a long time. The first humans, or any human relatives to ever set foot in the Americas, arrived somewhere between 13,000 and 20,000 years ago. They crossed from Asia into what is now Alaska during the last ice age, when a land bridge connected the two continents. That has been the accepted story for generations. It was taught in schools, printed in textbooks, and treated as settled fact. The Cerruti site was dated to 130,000 years ago. That means someone or something was in America 110,000 years before the first accepted arrival. Not a little earlier, not slightly before, more than 100,000 years before. To put that in perspective, 130,000 years ago, modern humans had only just appeared in Africa. We were brand new to the planet. We had not yet spread to Europe, Asia, or anywhere else. Neanderthals were the dominant species across Europe and Western Asia. A separate mysterious group called the Denisovans, only discovered by science in 2010, were living across parts of Asia. Nobody, according to everything science knew, was anywhere near America. So if this site is real, it means that while modern humans were still taking their first steps in Africa, something was already living in America, processing food, using stones as tools, surviving. That is what the date means. That is why it changes everything. And here is where it gets even darker. Whatever was living in America at 130,000 years ago left no genetic trace whatsoever. When scientists study the DNA of Native American populations today, they can only trace those lineages back roughly 15,000 to 20,000 years. The population at Cerruti existed more than 100,000 years before that. They are not in anyone's DNA. They are not in any database. They left no biological thread that connects to any living human being on Earth today. They are completely erased from the genetic record of our species. They were here, and then they were gone, as if they never existed at all. The findings were published in 2017 in a journal called Nature. Nature is one of the most respected and rigorous scientific journals on the planet. Every paper published there is examined and challenged by leading experts before it is approved. Getting a claim this extreme through that process meant the evidence had to withstand the scrutiny of some of the most skeptical minds in science. Those minds were waiting. And the moment that paper landed, they did not celebrate. They pushed back hard. Every objection and every answer. The reaction was immediate. Within days of the 2017 publication, leading archaeologists and scientists were publicly challenging the findings. The criticism was sharp, organized, and came from respected voices in the field. But the attack did not land where most people expected. Almost no serious scientist challenged the 130,000 year date itself. The uranium-thorium dating was consistent and solid across multiple samples. What they challenged was the interpretation. Their argument was simple and direct. Yes, those bones are 130,000 years old. But hominins did not break them. Something else did. They brought three specific charges. The first charge was the construction machinery. Critics argued that the heavy vibrating equipment used during the 1992 road project had fractured the bones, and what researchers were calling ancient hominin activity was actually modern industrial damage dressed up as prehistory. The researchers responded by examining the fracture edges under magnification. Every single broken surface was covered in ancient calcium carbonate crust. Calcium carbonate is a mineral that builds up on surfaces through thousands of years of contact with groundwater. It does not form in weeks or months or years. It takes enormous stretches of time. Those crusted edges proved the breaks happened in deep antiquity, long before any construction machine ever touched that ground. The second charge was the absence of shaped tools. At every confirmed ancient hominin site in Africa and Europe, researchers find shaped tools, hand axes, blades, and stones that have been deliberately carved into specific forms. At Ceruti, there were only plain, unmodified cobbles. No carving, no shaping, no deliberate modification. Critics said that without shaped tools, there was no credible evidence of hominin presence. The researchers responded by pointing to the oldest known tool use in human history. At African sites dating back over 3 million years, the earliest hominins also used plain, unmodified stones. The deliberate shaping of tools came much later in human development. The most primitive form of tool use is simply picking up a hard rock and using it as it is. The third charge was the most pointed. There were no cut marks on the bones. If hominins had been processing this mastodon for food, there should be microscopic scratches and striations on the bone surfaces left by stone tools cutting through flesh. None were found. Critics called this a fatal gap in the evidence. But here is what the critics did not fully account for. Cut marks are the signature of meat processing. Marrow is different. Marrow survives long after flesh has completely decomposed and disappeared. If this mastodon was already partially rotted or had been stripped by scavengers before the hominins arrived, there would have been no meat left to cut. They may have come specifically and solely for the bones. In that case, the absence of cut marks is not a hole in the evidence. It is actually consistent with a marrow-only operation. The critics also proposed that natural forces such as violent flooding could have produced the same patterns. But flooding sorts geological material by size and weight. It moves either heavy rocks or small fragments, not both together in the same location. At Ceruti, massive 30-pound cobbles and tiny delicate bone flakes were found sitting side by side in undisturbed fine silt. No flood on Earth produced that arrangement. The debate is still open, but it is no longer one-sided. And Ceruti is not the only site forcing these questions. What we keep refusing to see. Ceruti is not alone. Across the Americas, there are other sites with dates that cannot be comfortably explained by the accepted timeline. Chiquihuite Cave in Mexico has produced evidence dating to around 26,000 years ago. The Pedra Furada sites in Brazil carry dates that some researchers push past 50,000 years. Ceruti sits at 130,000 and stands as the most extreme outlier of all. These sites are scattered across an entire continent. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern. And American archaeology has a troubling history with patterns like this. For decades, the accepted model held that humans first arrived in the Americas no earlier than 13,000 to 15,000 years ago, crossing from Asia into Alaska during the last ice age. That model was treated as almost untouchable. Researchers who challenged it with older dates were professionally sidelined. Funding was pulled. Papers were rejected. The scientists who eventually proved that humans were in the Americas far earlier than 13,000 years ago spent years being ignored and dismissed before the evidence became impossible to deny. Ceruti exists in that same hostile atmosphere. The stakes of being wrong are career-ending. The stakes of being right are world-changing. The question of who these beings actually were is one that has never been seriously answered in public. Science has specific candidates. The most compelling is the Denisovans. Denisovans are a human cousin species that was only identified in 2010 from a single finger bone found in a cave in Siberia. They were genetically distinct from both Neanderthals and modern humans. They were present across Asia at exactly 130,000 years ago. And the full extent of where they traveled and how far they ranged remains almost entirely unknown, because the physical remains found so far amount to almost nothing. A Denisovan population, or a closely related archaic hominin group, crossing into America during the last interglacial warm period is not impossible. During that period, sea levels and land configurations were different. Pathways that are currently underwater may have been open. This is not a fringe fantasy. It is a hypothesis that serious researchers consider worth investigating. But these beings left almost nothing behind. No shaped tools, no confirmed fire sites, no art, no burials, just one partially processed mastodon and a handful of broken stones preserved in fine silt beneath a California road. They lived here. They were intelligent enough to plan ahead, select the right tools, work as a group, and extract nutrition from one of the largest animals on the continent. And then they vanished so completely that for 130,000 years, the world had no idea they had ever existed. The bones from Ceruti sit in museum drawers today, fragments of a story that most of the scientific world still refuses to fully accept. And the most disturbing thought is not what those bones represent. It is what we may have already lost. How many sites like this one have been destroyed by construction machines? How many have been dismissed by researchers too invested in the existing timeline to look honestly at the evidence? How many have simply never been recognized for what they were? The evidence for a far deeper human presence in the Americas may have been in front of us for decades, and we keep finding reasons not to believe it. If the Ceruti population was real, they were the true first Americans. Not a footnote, not a curiosity. The first. And we almost never knew they existed at all.